Okay, very good. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on a conversation about sustainability, innovation, and entrepreneurship. My name is Baumgarten. I'm the Alumni Agent Officer for UWC-USA, and momentarily I'll introduce our guest speakers and our moderator. But just as a heads up, as a reminder, this session is being recorded. You all should have received that a button to record. And we'll be holding off and making sure we have about 25 minutes for questions. With that, you're more than welcome to enter your questions into the chat. That way it'll allow our speakers to review the question beforehand, which would be very nice. And then obviously, once you do ask your question, if you do it live, please try to be as concise as possible for time's sake. We appreciate that. And with that, I will now introduce our speakers. Our two speakers have followed different paths through their work in sustainability and innovation, and through their passion and it's their passion that unites them in their work. So with that, our first speaker is Lidija Sekaric from the class of 1994. Lidija began her career in technology working for IBM on innovative semiconductors design. She was essentially mapping out the future of computer chips. In 2009, she began working for the U.S. Department of Energy to develop policy and research funding on clean energy. Since 2017, she has been involved in incubation initiatives in the clean energy space, including solar, battery, and grid services. After graduating from UWC-USA in 1994, Lidija earned a BS in physics at Bryn Mawr and subsequently a PhD in physics from Cornell. Our other speaker, Gabriel Levie, from the class of 2016. Gabriel had a passion for sustainability at UWC-USA that has translated into the launch of Wequity, a company supporting ESG initiatives using AI and data analytics. He drew from internships, mentors, and the benefits of an accelerator program to develop his company. After graduating from UWC-USA, Gabriel earned a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford, and a master's in economics from the Economic School of Louvain. And lastly, and most importantly, our moderator for today is Carl Martin Nelson, UWC-USA's Director of Communications. And so with that, Carl Martin, I will now turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Reed, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and there's no need for any other preamble, so I'm just going to start in with the questions for both of them. And what I want you both to do is to tell us a little bit about your work since leaving UWC-USA, a little bit. I know you both have done a lot, even Gabriel, in a relatively few years, but why did you both end up working in sustainability fields? So what have you been doing, and why are you in sustainability? Gabriel, you go first, please.
Oof, big questions from the start. So work's a large word for me. So I've been working for a few years. Mainly what I do today, indeed, is that I launched a startup 2 years ago that helps companies gather and collect data on a number of environmental and social metrics so that they can measure their progress on those metrics. And I also help then downstream investors who need to analyze companies themselves before they want to invest. Now, before I got into it, basically when I was in university, I got involved more in the activist sense of things. When you're very young, I think that's how where things starts, from a sense of injustice in the world, and realizing that at the time, the university I was in, actually they had huge amounts of money, and the US universities also have a lot of money, but they weren't doing anything about investing that endowment responsibly. And so that's where we did a lot of work just to push them and support them in moving that into more sustainable practices. The same could be done actually for UWC-USA, but that's for another discussion. And then bit by bit, when I came back to Belgium, linked this interest and sense of injustice and interest for this field with entrepreneurship, realizing that actually loads can still be done to support this transition. And bit by bit, got where I am today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Lidija, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for coming today. Very happy to see some familiar faces online today. So I followed traditional / non-traditional path, being educated as a physicist, it wasn't necessarily obvious that I would go into sustainability field. And I graduated grad school 20 years ago, college 26 years ago. There wasn't an obvious path necessarily of how to get into sustainability if you were a scientist. And what I think really cinched it for me after 6 years in the industry, not working on sustainability, I had my kids. And when I started looking at the timelines became very real. The timelines for, Southern Florida being submerged, where their grandparents live. And what will that mean for their kids, my grandkids, right? Those timelines, in fact, were so much more tangible. And I just felt like I probably would like to do something to keep the world a better place for them and everybody else, rather than safer for semiconductor chips. And so my foray into that being an obvious one, I had a wonderful entry as a science policy fellow at the Department of Energy. It's a program that's been running for 50 years now in DC to bring scientists and engineers to help with decision-making at the government. And so I could apply my technical skills right away, although learning was really christening by fire. And we can talk about, career transitions later. And again, it was very important for me to understand the policy landscape, because energy is a highly regulated field, as well as all of the technologies that one could work on. When my time at DOE coincided with both terms of Obama administration, and when the administration changed, I decided that there was a lot more work. And by then the industry had matured enough, and the overall economic situation was so different, that there were enough jobs in the private sector. And Gabriel can tell you a lot more about the appetite and the volume and scale that corporations are having in driving clean energy deployment. And so I felt like I was going to be more effective in that speed and scale work outside of government. I'll stop right here.
Great, thank you very much. My next question is actually kind of related to this one. It's about urgency. I write little profiles of all of the Davis scholars, and we send those off to Shelby in a booklet. And so I send them a form, and they answer a lot of questions in the form. I take their information and I write up these little profiles. I did a little search of the terms in the forms to find out what was important to them. 140 times the students referred to as sustainability or the environment or climate. About 100 times they referred to peace. So for the students, the 57 Davis students that are coming into our school and the other schools, sustainability is a seriously pressing issue, and there's an urgency on their part for us as a community, as a school, as a world to address this. How would the two of you sort of rate that urgency that you felt back when you were students at the school versus where you are right now, and how is that fueling your work and where you're at today? Gabriel, you talked about that a little bit. Do you want to take that on?
Sure. So, I haven't graduated that long ago, so the times haven't changed that much. But, if I look back at when I graduated, 2016, Paris Agreement was just signed. And I think actually, I would even say, maybe not in people's daily lives and minds, but at the policy level, I would even argue sometimes that climate change was higher on the agenda than today, a few years later, where you see COVID and a crisis like Ukraine, which is kind of really shifting the boundaries and the priorities in terms of like what's important. If you look at inflation rates across the world as well, I would actually even tend to argue, compared to a few years ago, I would say the urgency is a bit less there. At the policy level, maybe not at the individual level, but you still see dramatic shifts ongoing, right? Like with the Green Deal in Europe, a number of regulatory frameworks and push that's done. In the US, suddenly with the IRA, massive investments in fiscal subsidies. Suddenly big businesses can actually make money to push environmental transition. I think that's huge. And then you also see transition with electric vehicles, which is like speeding up hugely. The one thing I still find problematic compared to 2015 is that richer countries don't want to pay for the transition and mitigation of poorer countries adaptation to climate change and issues like that. So yeah, that's kind of quickly my thoughts on this question.
Thank you. Lydia, how about you?
Yeah, so one of the things that again, we talked a little bit earlier when we were preparing for this conversation about some facts and interesting numbers, and there's a lot of things that we'll mention that really should give us hope, in the sense that the transition is happening, that we are doing a lot of things right. As an example, global emissions have actually declined in the developed world, but the appetite for energy and the energy intensity is going up in the rest of the world, and it's where the growth is anyway. Now, if the emissions are going down, we also have to keep in mind that we are still seeing continued warming, because the concentrations of global warming gases are something there that came from our past actions, right? So they've accumulated, they're stayed, they need time to dissociate or get absorbed, or any number of things that you can do to help them move along. It is basically minute by minute that's getting worse. And so when people talk about every degree matters, the impact of every fraction of a degree, actually not every degree, really every fraction of a degree matters, is what's bringing the urgency so that we may tackle what's in our community at this point, saying everything, everywhere, all at once, right? So all segments as much as possible, as fast as possible. And so because our past will never leave us in terms of like the emissions that have already been emitted, we really have to work on it. Like, I don't want to say like there is no tomorrow, so there may be a tomorrow, right? And so that's really, really important. I think what's also really important to understand is that there are several very large levers in where the emissions come from, what we can do, how we can change it. So stationary power is well on a way to being turned over. There is, again, another interesting factoid. In 2023, with electricity, there will be more solar installed, new power capacity in the world. More solar will be installed than all other sources combined. Gas, wind, nuclear, coal, that does not mean the same amount of electricity will be produced, but dollar for dollar that investors are choosing to invest, solar outweighs everything altogether, right? Because they are choosing by price. There's a huge opportunity that is finally, I would say that dam is finally opened in transportation and mobility space, right? Especially with electric vehicle, with the popularity of micromobility options that are also electrifying, most importantly, in the developing world. And then there are a handful of segments that are pretty stubborn and hard to decarbonize, such as industry, shipping, and so on. But that is okay, because there's a lot of innovation going on in that space. So I think when it comes to the speed and scale field tackled successfully and is still working on stationary power segment, transportation, and then the rest of the segments, the rest of the wedges, if you will. Agriculture is also not non-negligible one, and there's a number of reasons there. So I'll pause here, but I think with the speed and scale and the urgency, everything we do every minute matters and will matter for a very long time. And there are some very large, obvious chunks of emissions that we can work to get out fast.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to like specifically react to what I found very, very exciting here is that the everything everywhere all at once, I think that's so true. I love the little analogy. I think, when you think as well in terms of all the careers that are going to be opening up in the space and in the world, like I would really emphasize this to remove the dichotomy of, okay, there's the sustainability space and there's the rest of the economy. Actually, it's really everywhere. Like all companies are going to have to decarbonize their practices, their production, and all industries have different requirements technically to do that. So you're going to have in each industry, you're going to need experts to support that transition, to innovate for new production, new services, finding new ways to make it affordable as well, and to be able to do it at scale. because it's nice to innovate at a small scale, but if you need to then like bring that forward across the industry, across the economy, there are a number of things that need to happen. And then a number of interesting ones as well that are going to jobs I think that are going to come up is the whole auditing. Like, you don't think about it, but today we audit, financial accounts. A number of like green claims are going to need to be audited as well. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of BS out there. So like, I think it's really interesting to see how this space is leading to lots of opportunities for people who actually want to, drive that transition too.
So you're kind of starting to answer my next question already, which is, when we look at the work, your career didn't really exist 15 or 20 years ago. What should we be telling our kids and our grandkids to be preparing for if they want careers in sustainability? Lidija, you or Gabriel, please take this question.
Yes. So I actually have kids very close to college age now, so I may have to be telling them this soon enough. So Gabriel actually mentioned accounting, right? And when I recently jokingly, not jokingly, was telling a colleague that people used to say, go into accounting, there will always be work. So I think we ought to tell people go into carbon accounting right now, which is growing, right? I think that there's so much opportunity, and I'll just give a handful of examples when it comes to the careers, right? And I think what's also really important, and I try to emphasize this to everybody, you don't have to ever be locked into one career. I mean, I changed my career, I pivoted. I might pivot again, but I'll still stay in clean energy. And I've had to touch everything. I've had to touch finance, and I've had to touch marketing, and I've had to touch technology development and policy and everything else, right? So don't be afraid. You're all very smart people. That's really never an issue. There is a very large opportunity in policy space, right? So if you are interested in working in lobbying in representatives' offices, in nonprofits that develop frameworks, in analysis shops that help move along some of those frameworks, there has been, at some point, maybe we'll do a follow-up, how many years there was the background and the foundation that was laid down for all of the policies that came out in the IRA, which was the huge US bill that passed recently, that is just tremendous for continuing supporting clean energy in the US. There is a lot of work to be done in, again, analysis and policy space. There's work to be done in communications. I would say to this day, there's still work to be done in communicating what climate change is, what any one of us can do. There is work to be done in technical fields. For example, as you may have seen in the news, there have been massive layoffs in a lot of what people call tech companies, which are really software-focused companies. And there was a large effort, sort of a grassroots-driven effort to recruit a lot of the software people into the climate space, right? There is a lot of work from, carbon accounting to managing e-mobility to any number of applications that require that software work. So I came from the hardware development space. And if you're interested in the science, there's a lot of work to be done in new battery chemistry. There's a lot of work to be done in how you capture carbon and store it permanently in a certain kind of rock or material. There's really work to be done in every, Gabriel said, sustainability is really, really important in functioning of many industries at this point. It's really integral, right? So we haven't even touched things like circularity and sort of sustainability of supply chain. But there's really an entry point just about anywhere. And I think it really has to match with your own interest.
Excellent, excellent. In the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward just a little bit here, and I'm going to ask, combine two questions here. One, you both come from sort of a mix of policy and entrepreneurship. And I'm curious about who is sort of pushing and advancing us the most right now. Are entrepreneurs advancing and pushing policy, or are policymakers sort of pushing and opening doors for entrepreneurs? How is that tug of war going there? Gabriel, do you want to start?
Sure, but I'm gonna have to be very cliche because they have to work hand in hand. Because on one hand, I think entrepreneurs can push the boundaries on what's physically possible with technology. On pushing the boundaries, and here an example is, look at electric vehicles. Now we can start charging them super quick. Because otherwise, in terms of autonomy, it becomes not very practical if you have to, do a lot of miles, and then after you have to stop your travel. Well, there are lots of companies that are innovating to charge electric vehicles very quickly. And there are huge numbers of examples. Second thing is, I think they can push boundaries on my mindset. I'm not a huge fan of Elon Musk, but he definitely drove and changed the mindset on what electric vehicles are possible and how to bring that at scale. They can also enable actually the realization of policymakers' roadmaps. They say, oh, we're going to be net zero by 2030, 2050. Well, actually, it's the whole companies need to then implement that through the incentives that the policymaker sets up. So entrepreneurs can definitely help. They can also definitely slow it down. Let's be honest. In Germany, car lobby is huge, and they've really recently managed to delay a number of requirements in terms of carbon and combustion engine production and use. Aviation lobby is huge. In the UK, I think if I'm not mistaken, internal flights don't have VAT. I found that ridiculous. So there are a number of things like that where actually companies can definitely slow it down. Let's be honest. And same with quarterly results. If you only need to publish and answer to incentives of investors every 3 months, well, climate is a long-term thing. So it's a long-term battle. So if you keep just optimizing every 3 months, you're going to have an issue. So I think entrepreneurs, again, they have both positives and negatives. And on the policy side, I think it's quite similar as well. They can support within fiscal incentives. Like you say, like Lidija mentioned with the IRA, they can support on transparency and reporting to make sure that we're actually talking the same language when we say we're actually going to be net zero and we're actually reducing our carbon emissions, and we're making a number of things. So there's the developing the language, forcing reporting, putting incentives so that actually it makes companies go into the right directions. But policymakers can also delay it, if they are not willing to put the actual political commitment to make a deal. Their incentive is the next election. If we're in a democratically elected, government, they're not going to do much. Or if they're in a country that's a bit poorer, well, priority is probably just putting food on the table. I'm stereotyping here, but you need to make sure as well that the incentives are correct. Anyways, so yeah, I think definitely hand in hand.
Lidija?
Yeah, gosh. So I've seen this change quite a bit over time, right? So it depends on the industry maturity and depends on the type of support that might be needed. So it's an example of, there are direct types of supporting entrepreneurs, like giving them grants that are in fact the most risk-free type of capital that an entrepreneur can receive, because they don't have to pay them back. Typically, it's not the same as the kinds of returns that the venture capitalists will put on the company and so on. There's also long-term market certainty that help every company just stick with it and have them. So that's the market signal, right? So being able to say we'll have tax credits for solar for the next 10 years or for hydrogen or whatever it is, really, really helps with the certainty there's going to be a market for all these new ideas. So that's sort of from the government and entrepreneurial side. From the entrepreneurs pushing the government, there is a point where the technologies start sticking, and let's say you might have an innovation that there are policies like direct support, financial support, but there are also policies, especially in the United States, that regulate, let's say, how electricity is sold and bought and so on. Those are really important in the regional. An innovation that allowed people to leave solar panels at homes is something that came from entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs actually figured out how to structure that and make that available to a homeowner as well. It hinges on a particular policy called net metering that, as distributed solar proliferates, some of the utilities are pushing back against it, but it's so popular that this entrepreneurial innovation is actually making those regulators pause and think about, are we going to pull this back now, right, or not? And they're not in a lot of cases. There is definitely, I think, in the last several years, a very, very large clout that an entity that was helped, let's say Tesla as an example, so car maker, right, side of things. They were helped with, $650 million loan from the Department of Energy 10, 15 years ago. And they are now, through consumer demand, actually changing the e-mobility space, making other car makers move along really in that same direction, which is also in turn making them lobby for any number of things that the US government is now propagating capability. So it really is a give and take, and it does depend on the maturity of the industry.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So here's another question. You kind of both have talked about this just a little bit, but as individuals here, the people on this call and people we know, what are some of the things that we could be doing to actually support sustainable innovation ourselves? We know that innovation is really important. I wouldn't know the first thing about how to encourage that. Can you give us some advice on what to do there? Gabriel, first.
First of all, I think it's important that everybody thinks about this, but I also don't think we should think about consider this an individual responsibility. It's definitely a collective and systemic thing that needs to change. That being said, I'm happy to answer your question anyways. I think you can consume responsibly and differently. Think about how, what actually is the environmental impact of what you're consuming. The obvious one is, stopping red meat that's actually mass produced, for example, because it consumes a lot of water. You can choose banks that decide to actually be responsible and be quite have serious due diligence on the project that they finance. You can invest in companies that are actually doing better or worse on a number of companies. Here, to be honest, on the stock market, you're not making much of a difference, but actually once you're going into private markets, private equity, venture capital, that's where you actually can make a difference with your investments. And the most important ones to me, I think, would say your job and the way you vote. And I'm not going to say more here, but the way, I think it's you spent in your career on average 80,000 hours, right? So if you can put even a fraction of those hours towards the transition, I think it's probably pretty impactful. And then in terms of voting, well, you're going to affect the regulator who affects the rest. And I think that's also pretty powerful. Those are my thoughts.
Sure, thank you. Lidija, what do you think?
I'm only going to say one thing. If you have $1 to spend it on a politician who supports climate change measures. It is absolutely the largest lever in changing the ecosystem for the innovators and making long-term certainty in the market, any number of things. So I think policy has always driven the viability of these technologies more than anything. I think innovation is going to be there, but there really has to be that support. And this is why it is not an even playing field relative to the traditional technologies. And so that support is needed. It is not free open market in so many ways, because it is, again, highly regulated. It is largely a monopolistic industry, at least I'm thinking when it comes to the power and fuel delivery and production. So those are some of the things that I think are really, really important if you're not in the field itself. And of course, if you can devote your waking hours to working sustainability, absolutely, that can help. But I do want to mention one other thing on innovation. Maybe we'll get to this in the myth busting session, but we have so many technologies that can be deployed right now that can make such a huge difference. But we also don't have to be sitting and saying, oh, we have to invent something entirely different, especially in a technology space. And I'm happy to talk about what it is we still will need to invent eventually, but we have some ways to go until we run into some of those walls. There's innovation in business space as well. So if you can find a better way of innovating business models that can help with that deployment, it's extremely useful.
Excellent, thank you. We have 2 more questions, and if folks have, then we'll open it up for questions for about 20 minutes or so. And if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat. Reed's kind of collecting those as we go, and then we'll sort of look at the questions. But right now, I want to shift a little bit here and talk about your UWC experiences. And I'm just curious how you think your UWC-USA experience sort of promoted the skills or the mindsets of being entrepreneurs, especially in the sustainability space. What happened there that sort of teed you up for where you are now? Gabriel, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll try. I think perhaps one main thing that I think is key if you want to go towards the entrepreneurial path is that you actually, at least a little bit, need to have the belief that what you do is going to be able to change the status quo. And you can't, like this way of looking at the world, not as a given, but as something that has been built over time through a number of actions that people and systems have done. And so it's actually the same for entrepreneurship, it's the same for activism, it's the same for whatever impact you can have, but you need to have a little bit of belief that you can actually change that status quo, even if it's just a drop in the ocean. And I think that's the main thing that UWC definitely contributes to and nourishes throughout the experience. I know, for example, at UWC-USA, you have the farms, you have the awareness of your ecosystem and where the food gets produced. There was actually, and I think still is, a small entrepreneurship program to support students. For me, that was huge. That's where I met both actually a current board members, Sebastian Derleux and Manolo, who were really keen to support students on entrepreneurship. I know as well on my graduation speech, the president at the time, Mukul, he said, failure is to fail, FAIL, is the first attempt in learning. Again, so to promote trying and being willing to take risks. So all those things I think contribute to this, just being able to conceptualize the world as, okay, I can actually try to change this.
And you get bonus points for remembering anything about your commencement speech from 20. Fantastic, very, very good. Lidija, how about you?
Yes, I would say more on a sustainability side, for sure. I mean, gosh, I had my eyes open at UWC. I mean, I came from what I would classify a developing country. Like I grew up in former Yugoslavia, now it's Montenegro, right? And I just remember, the thrill of something as mundane as Ali Kasimram started a recycling club on campus. And we were there washing the bottles by hand and putting them away and then trucking them off somewhere probably to be recycled. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. The society could do this, right? I mean, so little things, right? Awareness of, what meat production was doing to the rainforest at a time and things like that. I mean, even the tiniest bits of exposure to how people thought about global ecosystems, it was new to me and it changed my life. And that is not an exaggeration and an understatement at all. And I'm very grateful and I'm very lucky that I had that, right? Yeah, and I still remember it, Ali. Yes, that's how much is stuck in my head. So that is, I think, that global view, the view that in the end, there's plenty you'll do for yourself in life, but like, what are you actually going to do for others, right? And maybe I could have been a labor organizer the rest of my life, but I am a geek and I liked doing what I was doing, and I thought maybe I would apply that in this field.
Excellent. Thank you, Lidija. I'm going to go back to you with the last question before we go to questions from the group. And you already talked a little bit about the difference between sort of like, we have a lot of the stuff that we need right now that just needs to be implemented. And there are some future things down the road. Like, let's talk about those future things, because that's kind of fun too. Like, what are some of the future innovations or initiatives in the sustainability space that are going to be bigger or have a bigger impact than most people know? You two are on the inside of this a little more than we are, a lot more than we are. What do we not know about that's coming?
Oh gosh. So I'm going to again talk a lot more about energy production and consumption, right? There is a long way to go until we fill up our energy production system with, let's say, solar and wind that are they're called intermittent sources, right? So we want to flip that light switch, when we want to have that light on, and we won't think about, is there sun or is there wind? Long way to go before we have to apply certain measures, but over time, what we'll also need to develop, and when I say develop, it means really reduce cost, are technologies that are what we call baseload. So geothermal, advanced geothermal for power production, so geothermal for heating and cooling. I really hope that small modular or advanced nuclear, that's fission, a lot of people are also working on fusion technologies. That's probably longer term advance in time. There are technologies that fall in the category of replacing flexibility. So if we could put hydrogen in gas turbines, for example, when you need a little bit of flexibility to come online quickly, there are technologies for long duration storage, for seasonal, daily, 2-3 day, 7-day storage when the wind and sun are not consistent, as an example. All of those things need to come into play when we're at about 60% and higher penetration of renewables in electricity production. And we're at about 14% in the US now for electricity from intermittent sources, right? There is a very large movement right now. So sorry, what I was going to say is that with solar, wind, and batteries, as we know them, we can go a very, very long way, right? The other one is the carbon capture and utilization, right? So a number of folks, because we are stuck with this sort of carbon emissions that are already emitted, they're sitting in the atmosphere. A lot of entrepreneurs are looking at how can we cost effectively either capture them at a place of emission or extract them from the air and then do something like permanently store them in a rock in the ocean, in cement, and any number of things. That is also a set of technologies that I say it's important, again, for that last 20% effort, right? I think there is a lot of innovation, and there's going to be some very interesting things happening as the e-mobility becomes, or let's say EVs, as we switch to EVs, even 50% of cars sold when they're becoming electric vehicles only. Now it's about 7. We're going to start seeing some very interesting solutions in charging. Right? So that's an interesting set of words. I could talk about technology, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in resolving transmission. So if you are into looking at big projects and planning and right-of-way issues combined with environmental impact, that's something. So I'll stop again. See what Gabriel has to say.
Okay, Gabriel?
Not much. I think Lidija is way better versed in this topic than I am, so I'll leave it here.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you very much for your answers to these questions so far. And so, Reed, I think you might have, did we get some questions in the chat? I haven't actually been paying attention.
We don't currently have any questions in the chat, but with the size of the group we currently have, if somebody would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask away. Or you can put it in chat and I'd be happy to read it. So Katrin, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Katrin Scholz-Barth, and I'm currently in UWC-USA. I'm the inaugural sustainability manager, so I'm very happy to meet you, Gabriel, and Lidija. I'm very grateful for your advice. The question that I have, Gabriel, you started out saying in the beginning that your experience at college was that a lot of institutions had a lot of money but didn't do anything, and that same thing was true for UWC-USA. So I was curious to know what you would suggest UWC-USA to do as a priority list right now.
Oof, that was immediate. No, I could have guessed this. Well, first of all, lovely to meet you, Katrin. It's amazing that UWC has got a sustainability manager, and I'm really excited to follow what you do and would love to help indeed. With regards to what I meant on this specific topic is the endowment. And it's a very difficult question because I don't know exactly what the allocation of UWC's endowment is. I had once a conversation with the board members who manage the endowments to have this conversation. The real difficulty here is that this endowment is used to fund scholarships, to fund the school. So you have, in some form, you have on one hand, a responsibility to maximize the returns of that endowment in order to make the school's impact as good as possible and sustainable. On the other hand, I think there's a real question of, where is that money going? And if it's going in, if it's being invested with funds that support a number of, I would say, non-green activities, there's definitely some questions to be done here. It's a difficult topic, but because there's many ways of going about it. I'm not, for example, a huge fan of necessarily divesting. I don't think that actually it changes much at the actual stock market level. So divesting is, imagine tomorrow UWC were to sell all the shares in oil and gas, right, for example, or only invest in funds that don't do that. The problem here is that there's arbitrage on the market. There are some people who don't care about climate change, who are just going to buy those shares. And so you're not actually affecting what's going on the ground. So where it gets interesting is when you're going into private markets and potentially investing in, funds that enable capital, capital raises for companies that are actually doing technical innovations that are interesting here. So lots of things to do, lots of discussions to be held with the asset managers of the school on this topic as well. But so yeah, would love to help on this one. I think the first, just to start perhaps, was just say, okay, where actually are we investing this money and what are we doing with it? And I'm sure students would love to actually have a conversation in supporting as well and seeing how that could help.
No doubt the students would love to have a conversation. I'm 100% sure of that. Lidija, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I was actually fortunate to have had one conversation about this, at least with, and I think so there's somebody who's looking into these measures before. And there's definitely an opportunity to look at the school carbon footprint at the moment. And I know those are, that the school is looking at that, right? So there is the electricity consumption, there's the transportation. It's not humongous, but it's some. And there's probably, so when I say consumption, one could deal with the actual sources. So you could have, virtual power purchase agreements or on-site production, but also forms of consumption in terms of electrifying power consumption on campus, from the cafeteria to heating and cooling to, the typical uses of in buildings. So I think at least some of those measures are quite significant, or could be significant. But also, I think that if it ends up, if the campus is heading towards that, carbon neutrality direction, right? It could really leverage it as a significant marketing point too, in terms of attracting students and in terms of being a regional resource, right? So I think it really depends on, I don't know what the budget is like. I don't know how much appetite and willingness there is to, some of these measures can take a while to pay back. Some of them can be no-brainers, and New Mexico has reasonable policies in all kinds of ways, including community solar, things like that. They could host a large installation on behalf of others and things like that. So I think it just really depends on the budget and depends on the timeline.
Yeah, and interesting to point out that we could be, we want to be a model for other schools and other organizations in the region and in the country, frankly. And this could present an option or a possibility for leadership on our part. But of course, as Gabriel points out, very, very complex.
If I can react quickly, Carl Martin, if I may, the small thing that for me has been puzzling me on this topic of how can the school become sustainable is it at the fundamental level, is it sustainable to get people to fly out once or twice a year from across the world to the school? I think it's definitely always worth it because the experience that you give and the impact can be amazing afterwards. But there's something about the flying thing that bugs me a bit. But yeah.
And other schools are, a lot of folks are taking that question up as a school, as a movement, that we need to take a look at our travel and the impact of that for sure. No question of that. Other questions? I have a question I skipped over. I could go back to that if you'd like, unless someone else has another question here quickly. Okay, I'm going to go to my question that I skipped because I thought we weren't going to have enough time. I was going to ask both of you if there are sustainable enterprises that you think most seriously need more funding, like now, like enterprises, parts of the movement. Maybe another way to ask this question is if you had $1 billion that you could hand out to that you could invest that would move the needle the most dramatically on sustainability, where would you put that? Lidija, you talk about the levers. Do you want to talk about the lever that you might want to invest in?
Yeah, so I mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, there's a pretty wide range of entities that do really good work in directing policies, right? So at the moment, I would probably say some of the larger nonprofits. There used to be think tanks that they used to do good work. There used to be industry associations. I would say industry associations always end up being the industry way, fighting for a very specific niche interest that may not be globalized and maximized. But I would probably say a number of environmental nonprofits, if not direct. There are occasional movements that have been formed around certain issues. So the very, very young, both in its existence and age of the participants, Sunrise Movement as an example, they were pretty vocal and I would say impactful in the last presidential election. But at least in the US, and again, we may have global audience here. I think at least in the US, environmental focused nonprofits, sometimes not necessarily the largest ones because they don't need $1 billion, are probably effective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gabriel, what do you think? Oop, you're on.
It's a tough one. So if we go on the NGO and nonprofit side of things, we're actually donating the money. I agree, I would go for advocacy and changing policy, but I would also potentially look at, it's kind of basic and many people are doing it in the wrong way, but preventing ecosystems and biodiversity to be like preventing deforestation, I think is a pretty powerful one. So lots of NGOs are actually just like supporting local communities in maintaining their land in the Amazon forest, for example, and not having to sell it to corporations that will then exploit it for agriculture or whatever. I think that's a pretty powerful one. Then in terms of actually investing in enterprises, I think it's a difficult one. Sadly, sometimes if you want to look at the marginal impact of the money you're going to spend, it's counterintuitive, but you need to look at what are the low-hanging fruits sometimes as well. And the low-hanging fruits are actually changing industries that are heavily polluting into industries that are a bit less polluting. And that's, I think, in the marginal, if you look at it in the marginal sense, it's probably in the short term, the way to go.
Okay,
I have a follow-on question, actually, / comment for Gabriel, because you are in ESG qualification, if you will, space, right? Or as we call it, measurement verification. And an example of, retaining forests and nature-based carbon credits that used to be popular and sort of the default carbon credit that a lot of corporations used to purchase. Has there been a movement in the ESG space for corporations to acquire and develop higher quality measures that are more verifiable, that are more permanent, that tackle shared problems and so on?
I think for sure. I think mainly, I can only speak from my very limited and personal experience, what I see here in Europe, for example, that the regulator is actually forcing loads of companies through a number of frameworks that are standardized and universal to look at those environmental and soon social factors in the same way. So that, because today it's a nascent field, like in the same way that financial accounting at some point was a nascent field. Since it's a nascent field, people are actually measuring things in the way they want. They're reporting about climate change and their green actions in the way they want. And it's kind of confusing and it's full of greenwashing. The problem is, sadly, in many cases, unless you're forced to do it in a certain way and you have the right incentives to do it in a certain way, you're not necessarily going to do it because it requires quite a lot of work. But I see the regulator definitely, for example, in Europe, you have the big thing that came up first was the EU taxonomy, questionable in many ways, but it's actually setting up a vocabulary for climate change actions and soon biodiversity actions and practices for each company so that they can relate their own activities with specific climate change and biodiversity, like impact and metrics. And I think that's definitely moving in the right direction, but it's a very slow one. And, the difficult one here as well is that you want to make sure that you're not adding too much red tape on companies either. If you look at SMEs, if suddenly they have to spend a lot of money in their budget on like reporting and measuring, well, a lot of them might go, like, I'm not going to say bankrupt, but it's like a serious cost that they have to bear. So you need to find the right balance. And so that's why it's actually quite a slow process. But I think it's definitely like moving forward. Start on climate change, bit by bit on biodiversity, and like slowly on social, I think, aspects as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for us as a group here?
If there isn't one, I have one for Lidija.
Okay, great. Go for it, Gabriel.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, Lidija alluded to it a bit earlier as well, is if there's one myth related to sustainability that a lot of people just take for granted, but actually just untrue, that you think people should know about. I'm really curious to hear what you think that would be.
I think I mentioned it earlier that it's incredible how how long this has persisted, is that we don't have the technology needed to transition. And we absolutely do. We do not need to spend time developing them. We just need to, some have been already commercialized, of course, in solar and wind and mature, and in fact, lots of funding. There's just the need to set up the regulatory framework, financing to get things deployed. And so that turnover is going to happen at a certain rate, but there is no reason we have to go a very, very long way before we again come across certain issues like where we don't have solutions. And by then we will have those solutions for sure.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that, I think we're going to wind things down. Reid, did you have any closing thoughts before we sign off here?
Well, first, just want to thank Gabriel and Lidija and you, Carl Martin, for making your time available, and for all the people who signed in and are viewing this. Thank you for attending as well. If you do have any follow-up questions for, again, Gabriel or Lidija, they have provided their emails in the chat. And if for any reason you forget that, you can always reach back to us. We will also be sending out, following this in a day or two, the copy of just to the link to see the recording and another opportunity for any follow-up at that point in time. But I always say this, our greatest resource at UWC-USA is our alumni. And without any doubt, we've seen two amazing examples of that. And they are not